Bikers destroy a disabled veteran's wheelchair. Then her K9 takes action. The drowsy hum of Millwood's quiet afternoon snapped apart under the guttural roar of motorcycle engines. The Thunder Riders, a roughneck gang draped in weathered leather, rolled into the gravel lot outside Ellen's diner, their bikes snarling like chained beasts. They zeroed in on Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old Army vet confined to a wheelchair, parked near the diner's faded sign with her service dog, Titan, a German shepherd whose piercing eyes glinted like polished steel. The gang fanned out around her, boots grinding into the dirt, their laughter harsh and jagged as broken glass. Jake Razor Dillon, the pack's leader, swaggered forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Sarah. "What's a gimpy lieutenant got left, huh?" he growled, his voice dripping with contempt. He slammed his boot into her wheelchair's wheel, the frame shuddering under the blow. Then with a sneer, he swung a crowbar down on the armrest. Metal splintered with a shriek, the chair tilting as shards clattered to the ground. "You and your mutt gonna save the day?" His crew cackled, egging him on as he loomed closer. Sarah didn't blink. Her hazel eyes met his, cold and unyielding, like she was staring down an enemy trench. Titan stood rigid beside her, a low rumble vibrating in his throat, his hackles spiking. But he held, waiting. They had no clue what they'd stepped into. Titan wasn't just a service dog. He'd been forged in the crucible of Afghanistan, dragging Sarah from rubble and tearing through threats with surgical precision. And Sarah, 3 tours under her belt, had outfoxed Taliban kill squads with a tactical mind that cut deeper than their swagger. This wasn't bullying. It was a declaration of war, and they'd lit the fuse. Sarah lived alone on a modest farmstead just beyond Millwood's edge, a scrap of earth she'd wrested into a life after an IED shredded her legs 7 years ago. Every fence post pounded into the soil, every vegetable row scratched from the dirt. It was hers, built by calloused hands and sheer will. Independence wasn't a gift. It was a battle she'd won. Titan was more than her legs. He was her shadow, 90 pounds of muscle and devotion, trained to fetch her keys and to rip out throats when the moment called. Razor, a washed-up Marine booted for breaking every rule, saw a frail woman in a busted chair. He couldn't have misjudged her more. The diner door banged open, and Ellen Harper burst out, a wiry woman with silver hair and fire in her veins. She brandished a wooden spatula like a club. "Get the hell off my lot, you punks!" she bellowed, her voice slicing through the gang's jeers. Razor smirked, tossing the crowbar aside with a clatter, but the damage was etched in the air. Inside, a teenage kid pressed against the window, phone up, capturing it all. Wheelchair trashed, Titan coiled like a spring, Sarah's defiance unshaken. By sundown, the clip hit the web, racking up thousands of views, a spark igniting Millwood's quiet fury. Sarah didn't waste breath on self-pity. She hobbled home on borrowed crutches, Titan pacing beside her, his ears flicking at every sound. At the farm, she dialed numbers. Ellen arrived first, still steaming from the diner clash. Sheriff Dan Brooks came next, his badge gleaming, but his face lined with frustration at the riders' unchecked chaos. Doc Harper, a grizzled Vietnam vet turned town medic, shuffled in, his medic bag slung over one shoulder. A handful of others trickled through the screen door, farmers with calloused fists, shopkeepers with tired eyes, all drawn by the viral video and the steel in Sarah's voice. "They think we're prey," she said, her tone low and deliberate, like a commander briefing her squad. "We'll prove they're wrong." She turned her cramped kitchen into a war room, spreading a dog-eared map of Millwood across the table. 3 tours had taught her how to weaponize terrain and people. She traced lines with a steady finger. Ellen's diner as command central, her farm as the fallback, narrow roads as choke points. "Titan's my scout," she said, resting a hand on his broad head, feeling the heat of his fur under her palm. His ears twitched, alert. "You're my muscle." The riders had picked a fight with the wrong woman, and Sarah was gearing up to bury them. The gang didn't relent. 2 nights later, firelight danced across the horizon as her barn went up in flames, the acrid bite of gasoline choking the air. A note stabbed into her gate with a switchblade read, "Diners next." The Thunder Riders roared through town, their engines a taunting chorus, betting fear would buckle her. It didn't. She called her crew to Ellen's back room, sketching moves on a napkin with a stubby pencil. "They're loud, not clever," she said, tapping the map. "We turn that against them." Titan sat at her feet, his amber eyes locked on her, instincts humming. She handed out jobs. Ellen on watch, feeding intel from the diner's perch. Brooks on containment, ready to block their exits. Doc on standby, his med kit prepped for whatever came. She drilled them in signals. 2 whistles for trouble, a raised fist for hold, showing them how to use alleys, hills, the creek's bend to outflank the bikes. "They'll hit me head on," she said, a faint smile tugging her lips. "That's when we strike." Razor stood 6'3", scars crisscrossing his knuckles from barroom brawls, a king in his own mind. Kicked out of the Marines for screwing up one too many times, he'd made Millwood his turf, shaking down businesses, smashing windows, ruling through terror. Sarah was different, though. He didn't just want her scared, he wanted her crushed. Trashing her chair was his opening gambit, a power play to flex his reign. He hadn't counted on her turning his game into a gauntlet. By week's end, the air buzzed with tension. The riders rumbled past the diner daily, engines snarling, daring her to flinch. She didn't. Each night she sat on her porch, crutches propped nearby, Titan's head resting in her lap as she ran scenarios in her head. Millwood wasn't just her refuge, it was her stand. Razor had crossed a line she'd drawn in blood years ago, and she'd make damn sure he regretted it. The glow of Sarah Mitchell's burning barn painted the night sky an angry orange, the crackle of timber and the hiss of melting metal drowning out the cricket's song. The Thunder Riders had struck hard, their bikes tearing away into the dark as flames devoured years of her labor. Hay bales, tools, the old tractor she'd painstakingly rebuilt. By the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, choking on smoke and swearing at the stench of gasoline, there was little left to save. Sarah watched from her porch, crutches braced under her arms, Titan's fur brushing her leg as he stood sentinel. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed dry. This wasn't a loss, it was a gauntlet thrown. Pinned to her gate with a rusted switchblade, the note fluttered in the wind. "Diner's next." Razor's handwriting, jagged and bold, was a promise of more ruin. Most would have crumbled, but Sarah had faced worse. Sandstorms hiding IEDs, nights pinned down by sniper fire. She'd buried fear long ago. Instead, she turned to Titan, his amber eyes catching the firelight. "They think we're done," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Let's show them what done looks like." By morning, word of the arson spread through Millwood like a brush fire. Ellen Harper banged on Sarah's door at dawn, her face flushed with outrage. "Those bastards won't touch my diner," she snapped, slamming a thermos of coffee on the table. Sheriff Dan Brooks rolled up an hour later, his cruiser kicking up dust, his usual calm fraying at the edges. "I can't pin this on Razor without proof," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "But I'll be damned if I let them burn this town down." Doc Harper shuffled in last, his medic bag slung over one shoulder, muttering about punks who'd get a bayonet in Nam. Sarah didn't waste time on platitudes. She spread her map wider, pinning it with mismatched mugs. "They're escalating," she said, her voice clipped, like briefing a squad before a dawn raid. "That means they're scared enough to hit hard instead of smart. We use it." She traced a finger along the town's veins, Main Street, the creek, the old mill road. "They'll come for me again, but this time, we're the ones setting the trap." She turned Millwood into her battlefield. Ellen became her eyes, perched at the diner's counter with a notepad, logging every rider sighting. Bike colors, rider builds, patterns. Brooks turned his deputies into a loose perimeter, patrolling the outskirts to slow the gang's runs. Doc rigged a first aid stash in the diner's basement, his hands steady despite the tremor of age. Sarah drilled the rest. Farmers like Tom Grayson, who knew every back trail. Shopkeepers like Maria Ruiz, who could spot a stranger a mile off. She taught them signals, a whistle for movement, a raised hand for standby, a sharp clap for go. "Stay quiet, stay sharp," she said. "They'll hear us when it's too late." Titan was her edge. 3 nights after the barn fire, a lone rider crept onto her land, some wiry kid with a Molotov cocktail, sent to test her. Sarah spotted him from the window, his silhouette clumsy against the moonlit field. She tapped Titan's flank twice, a silent command from their Afghan days. The German shepherd melted into the shadows, a ghost on paws, circling wide. When the kid raised the bottle to light it, Titan struck, 90 pounds of muscle slamming into his chest, pinning him to the dirt. The bottle rolled free, unlit, as Titan's jaws hovered an inch from the kid's throat, a growl vibrating the air. Controlled, not fatal, just as she'd trained him. Sarah hobbled out, crutches sinking into the mud. "Tell Razor he's running out of moves," she said, her voice flat as she loomed over the trembling punk. Titan stepped back at her nod, sitting with ears pricked, ready for more. The kid bolted, leaving his pride and the Molotov behind. Word spread fast. Sarah's dog wasn't just a pet, and she wasn't folding. The riders doubled down. They roared through town at dusk, tossing bottles at shop windows, revving engines outside homes until kids cried and dogs howled. Ellen's diner took a brick through its front glass, a warning shot that sent her regulars ducking. Razor strutted at the helm, his scarred face twisted in a grin. Betting chaos would break Millwood's spine. He didn't see the shift, the way Tom Grayson lingered on his porch with a shotgun, how Maria Ruiz started locking her store late, a crowbar tucked under the counter. Sarah's crew wasn't loud, but they were hardening. She kept Titan close, his presence a steady pulse in the storm. Nights on the porch became strategy sessions, her flashlight beam dancing over the map as she marked rider routes. "They're sloppy," she told Ellen one evening, the older woman nursing a coffee beside her. "Too many bikes, too much noise. Means they're stretched thin. We hit their edges, not their core." Ellen nodded, her spatula swapped for a pencil, scribbling notes like a field officer. Brooks brought intel from a snitch, a barfly who'd overheard Razor bragging about finishing the cripple. "He's got a hard-on for you," the sheriff said, leaning against her kitchen counter. "This ain't just about turf." Sarah's brow furrowed. Something nagged at her, a flicker of memory from her Marine days, a name tied to a screw-up she'd buried. She shook it off. "Doesn't matter," she said. "He's a bully with a bike. I've broken worse." The breaking point loomed at Millwood's crossroads, a dusty stretch where Main Street met the Mill Road, flanked by a gas station and a sagging oak. Razor picked it for his stand, rolling in with 10 riders at high noon, engines snarling like a pack of wolves. Townsfolk peeked from windows as he dismounted, his boots kicking up dirt. "Mitchell!" he bellowed, voice carrying over the rumble. "Crawl out here and face me, or I torch this dump, starting with the diner." Sarah didn't rush. She rolled up in a borrowed chair, Ellen's spare, creaky but functional, Titan pacing beside her, his leash loose in her hand. Her crew fanned out, unseen. Tom behind the gas pumps, Maria in the station's shadow, Brooks idling his cruiser a block back. Razor smirked, his lieutenant, Vince Fang Russo, twirling a chain at his side. "Last chance, soldier girl," Razor taunted. "Kneel or burn." She didn't kneel. She locked eyes with him, her voice cutting through the din like a blade. "You think I'm scared of loudmouths with toys? I've buried better men than you." Then she tapped Titan's flank. 3 quick pats. "Go!" The shepherd launched, a blur of black and tan straight for Fang. The chain clattered as Titan's jaws clamped his wrist, a precise bite snapping bone without tearing flesh. Fang screamed, dropping to his knees, the chain useless in the dirt. Titan released at Sarah's whistle, pivoting to stand guard, teeth bared at the stunned riders. Controlled chaos, her signature. The crowd gasped, phones up, filming every second. Razor's grin faltered, his crew shifting uneasily as their enforcer whimpered. Sarah didn't flinch. She raised a megaphone Brooks had slipped her voice booming. "Jake Dillon, you're done. Your trafficking ring's exposed. Guns, drugs, all of it. Smile for the cameras because your bosses won't save you now." Razor's face twisted, rage overtaking shock. "You don't know shit," he roared, lunging for her. Titan growled, but Sarah waved him off. She wanted this moment. She swung a crutch up, catching Razor's shin, toppling him into the dust. He scrambled up, spitting dirt, but the damage was done. His crew hesitated, eyes darting as sirens wailed in the distance. State police, tipped by Brooks. Ellen stepped from the diner, arms crossed, her regulars behind her with brooms and bats. Tom leveled his shotgun from the pumps. Maria brandished her crowbar. Millwood wasn't hiding anymore. Razor's empire cracked, and Sarah stood, or sat, at its center, tight in her sword, her will the shield. She'd planned every beat, lured him here, let him overreach, turned his own noise against him. But as the dust settled, that nagging memory clawed back. Razor's snarl, his hate, it wasn't random. Afghanistan, 2014, a botched airstrike she'd reported. A Marine officer's career torched by her pen. She'd known a Jake Dillon once, and he'd never forgiven her. Dust swirled around the Millwood crossroads as Jake, Razor Dillon, staggered to his feet, his face a mask of fury and dirt. Sarah Mitchell sat steady in her borrowed wheelchair, Titan at her side, his amber eyes locked on the gang leader like a predator sizing up prey. The Thunder Riders faltered, their bikes idling unevenly as Vince Fang Russo clutched his shattered wrist, whimpering in the gravel. Townsfolk lined the edges. Ellen Harper with her arms crossed, Tom Grayson with his shotgun raised, Maria Ruiz gripping her crowbar. Phones up, capturing every flinch. Razor's roar of defiance had crumbled into a snarl, his authority teetering as state police sirens grew louder, closing in. Sarah lowered the megaphone, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. You're not just a thug, Razor. You're a trafficker. Guns, ammo, dirty cash. I've got names, dates, drop points. Your boys might ride loud, but they talk louder when the law leans in. She nodded toward Sheriff Dan Brooks, who stepped from his cruiser, handcuffs glinting in the noon sun. The riders shifted, eyes darting, some to Razor, some to the horizon where flashing lights crested the hill. Lies, Razor spat, his scarred hands balling into fists. You're a washed-up cripple spinning stories. But his voice cracked, and his crew didn't rally. Fang's collapse had shaken them. Titan's surgical strike proving Sarah wasn't bluffing. She leaned forward, her hazel eyes boring into him. Keep talking, Jake. Every word's on tape. Your bosses'll love hearing you squirm. The crowd buzzed, a ripple of whispers turning into shouts. Trafficker, someone yelled. Get him out of here. Ellen's regulars edged closer, brooms and bats in hand, their fear burned away by outrage. Razor wheeled on them, his bravado fraying. Back off, you hicks, or I'll... His threat died as a low growl rolled from Titan's throat, the shepherd stepping forward, teeth bare just enough to freeze Razor mid-step. Before he could recover, a new sound cut through the standoff, the deep rumble of a military-grade engine. A dust-streaked Humvee rolled up behind Brooks's cruiser, its door swinging open. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, his army fatigues crisp despite the road grime. Captain Mark Reynolds, Sarah's old CO from Afghanistan, surveyed the scene with a gaze that could crack stone. Stand down, Dillon, he barked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd commanded under fire. You're done here. Razor's sneer faltered, recognition flickering in his eyes. Reynolds, he hissed like the name was a curse. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't seen Mark in years, not since she'd left the service. But his presence clicked a puzzle piece into place, that nagging memory from the porch is solidifying into truth. Reynolds strode forward, ignoring the rider's uneasy stares. Lieutenant Mitchell called me last night, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Said she'd sniffed out a ghost from Kabul, took me a red-eye from Fort Bragg to confirm it. He stopped beside Sarah, resting a hand on her chair. Jake Dillon, dishonorably discharged, 2014. Ring a bell, Razor? Sarah's mind flashed back. Kandahar, summer heat, thick as tar, a botched airstrike she'd witnessed. Razor, then a Marine captain, had ignored her intel, called in a strike on bad coordinates. The explosion lit up a village, not a Taliban hideout. Women, kids, gone in a heartbeat. She'd filed the report, her words ending his career, stripping him of rank and honor. He'd vowed revenge as they dragged him out, his screams echoing in the dusty compound. You'll pay, Mitchell. She'd buried it, another scar among many, until now. You, Razor growled, his voice trembling with hate. You ruined me. That report, my life, gone, because of your damn mouth. He lunged again, but Titan intercepted, slamming into his chest with a snarl, pinning him to the dirt. The shepherd's jaws hovered over Razor's throat, a hair's breadth from ending it, controlled, waiting for Sarah's word. "Enough," she said, her whistle sharp. Titan backed off, sitting at her side, his gaze never leaving Razor. "You ruined yourself, Jake. I just wrote it down." She turned to Reynolds. "He's been running guns since?" Reynolds nodded, his face grim. "After the Corps cut him loose, he fell in with traffickers, ex-cons, mercenaries. Built the riders as a front. Your barn wasn't random, Sarah. He's been tracking you since you left Walter Reed, waiting to hit back." He pulled a folder from his pack, tossing it to Brooks. "ATF's been sniffing his trail. Your intel sealed it." Brooks flipped through. Photos, wiretaps, manifests. "Christ," he muttered. "He's been moving AR-15s through the county, right under my nose." He snapped the folder shut, signaling his deputies. "Cuff him." Razor thrashed as steel bit his wrists, his curses drowned by the crowd's cheers. His crew fractured. Some revved their bikes and bolted, only to hit Brooks' roadblocks. Others dropped weapons, hands up, as state troopers swarmed in, rifles drawn. Fang, still cradling his wrist, surrendered with a whimper. The riders' range shattered in minutes. Their king toppled by a woman they'd mocked and a dog they'd underestimated. Sarah exhaled, the weight of years lifting slightly. Titan pressed against her, his warmth grounding her as adrenaline ebbed. Reynolds knelt beside her chair, his voice softening. "You didn't just survive him, Lieutenant. You buried him. Again." She managed a faint smile. "Had help this time, sir." Ellen pushed through, her spatula swapped for a fierce hug. "You're one hell of a woman, Sarah Mitchell," she said, tears streaking her weathered cheeks. Tom and Maria joined, their weapons lowered, faces lit with something new. Pride, not fear. Millwood had watched her fight, and they'd fought with her. Brooks hauled Razor to the cruiser, the ex-Marine's head bowed, his empire ash. "You think this is over?" he spat as the door slammed. "They'll come for you." But his words rang hollow. His bosses, whoever they were, wouldn't touch a bus this public. The cameras had caught it all. Titan's takedown, Sarah's stand, the truth spilling out. Razor's vendetta had backfired, lighting a fire that burned him instead. As troopers cleared the scene, Reynolds lingered. "Knew you'd land on your feet, Mitchell," he said, glancing at Titan. "Well, close enough." She chuckled, the sound rusty but real. "Titan's my legs, sir. Always has been." The crossroads emptied, dust settling under a graying sky. Sarah stayed, watching the last rider bike towed off, her mind replaying Razor's fall. She'd beaten him in 14 with a pen, now with a town and a dog. But victory didn't erase the cost. Her barn, her peace, the ghost that still woke her screaming. Titan nudged her hand, his nose cool against her skin, pulling her back. "We're okay, boy," she whispered, stroking his fur. "We're okay." Millwood wouldn't forget this day. The riders were gone, their shadow lifted. But Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the town. Razor's arrest was a win, but his world had deeper roots. She'd uprooted one, and she'd be ready for the rest. With Titan at her side and a town at her back, she'd turned a broken wheelchair into a rallying cry. The war wasn't done, but she'd damn well won this battle. The dust of the Crossroads battle settled over Millwood, leaving a town transformed in its wake. Razor's arrest echoed beyond the gravel lot. State troopers hauled off the Thunder Riders' remnants, their bikes impounded, their swagger silenced. Jake Dillon's threats faded into the clank of a cell door, his trafficking empire exposed on every newsfeed from here to the state line. Sarah Mitchell sat on her porch that evening. Titan sprawled at her feet, his breathing steady as the sun dipped below the fields. Her barn was gone, her wheelchair still a mangled wreck, but the weight on her chest felt lighter than it had in years. Millwood didn't let her rebuild alone. The next morning, Ellen Harper pulled up in her beat-up pickup, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a toolbox in the other. "You're not lifting a damn hammer on crutches," she declared, rallying a crew before Sarah could protest. Tom Grayson arrived with lumber hauled from his shed, Maria Ruiz with nails and paint from her store. Doc Harper patched Titan's minor scrapes from the fight, muttering about damn fine soldier dogs. By week's end, a new barn rose from the ashes. Smaller, rougher but sturdy, built by hands that had once trembled before the riders. Sarah watched it all, leaning on a borrowed cane, Titan's head resting against her knee. "Didn't ask for this," she said to Ellen one dusk, the older woman wiping sweat from her brow. Ellen snorted. "You didn't ask for that bastard burning your place either. We take care of our own." It wasn't charity, it was defiance. A town refusing to let Razor's fire be the last word. The fight had sparked something bigger. Captain Mark Reynolds stayed a week, bunking at Brooks's spare room, his Humvee a fixture in town. He sat with Sarah one night, a bottle of bourbon between them, and laid out a plan. "You've got a gift, Mitchell," he said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders. "Leadership. Real kind, not just barking. Vets out there need that." She frowned, but he pressed on. "Start a network. Ex-soldiers helping ex-soldiers. You've already got Millwood behind you." She thought of the faces she'd trained. Farmers turned sentries, shopkeepers turned scouts. Then she thought of Titan, his scars matching hers, his loyalty a mirror to her own. "Maybe," she said finally, sipping the bourbon, "if it keeps one vet from drowning, it's worth it." The network took root fast. Tim "Rookie" Sanders was her first recruit, a lanky kid who'd ridden with the riders. Barely 20, his hands more ink than skin. He'd surrendered at the crossroads, hands shaking as he dropped his knife. Brooks vouched for him, and Sarah saw something in his hollow eyes. Regret, not malice. She put him to work on the farm, teaching him to mend fences instead of break them. "I thought Razor was a hero," he admitted one day, hammering a post. "Till I saw you and that dog." She clapped his shoulder. "Heroes don't burn barns, kid. They build them." Titan's legend grew too. A VA rep caught wind of the crossroads footage. 90 pounds of fur and muscle disarming a thug without a drop of excess blood. They called Sarah, pitching a program. Combat-trained service dogs for vets with PTSD or injuries. "He's proof they can do more than fetch," the rep said over the phone. She looked at Titan, sprawled in the grass, and smiled. "He's proof they can save you." The first litter started training that fall. Titan's name on the paperwork as the blueprint. Razor faced the music in a county courtroom, his leather jacket swapped for an orange jumpsuit. The trafficking charges piled high. Decades behind bars, no parole. His final rant from the stand. "Mitchell framed me," fell flat, the judge's gavel drowning his voice. His bosses, shadowy figures in the gun trade, cut ties the moment the cameras rolled. Revenge had been his fuel, but it ignited Sarah's purpose instead. From a wheelchair he'd smashed, she'd forged a legacy he couldn't touch. Millwood changed, subtly but deep. The diner's broken window got a new pane, etched with "Ellen's Stand" in looping script, a quiet nod to the fight. Brooks beefed up patrols, his deputies no longer shrugging at bike rumbles. Tom and Maria started a watch group, trading shotguns for walkie-talkies, keeping the peace Razor had shattered. Fear didn't vanish, but it shrank, replaced by a grit that felt like home. Sarah felt it too. She traded crutches for a new chair, sleek, custom, a gift from Reynolds before he left. She rolled it through the farm, Titan trotting beside her, inspecting the barn's fresh paint. Nights still brought dreams, explosions, screams, Razor's snarl blending with Taliban gunfire. But Titan's nudge woke her, his weight a tether to now. "We made it," she'd whisper, and he'd settle closer, guarding her sleep. A year later she stood, or wheeled, at the farm's edge, the Veterans Network humming with a dozen members. Rookie, now Tim, ran errands for Doc, his tattoos fading under sun and sweat. The VA program had 10 dogs placed, their handlers calling Titan the OG. Sarah traced the horizon, her hand in Titan's fur, and felt something she hadn't in years. Peace, jagged but real. One spring evening, she drove her chair to the crossroads, now just a quiet stretch of dust. Titan loped beside her, his muzzle graying but his stride strong. She stopped under the oak, its branches swaying, and pulled a photo from her pocket. Her squad in Kabul, young and unbroken, Razor's face among them before it all went wrong. "You lost, Jake," she said, tucking it away. "We won." Titan barked once, sharp and clear, like he agreed. She smiled, rolling home as the sun sank, the town's lights flickering on. Millwood wasn't perfect. Scars lingered in its streets, its people, but it stood taller. Sarah and Titan had turned fear into resilience, proving strength wasn't in legs or guns, but in courage, loyalty, and a community that refused to kneel. From a broken chair, they'd built something unbreakable.